Much, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us for this inaugural symposium. There is a lot to talk about, so let's get straight to it. So just for the quick format, I am going to totally abuse my prerogative as moderator and dominate for as much as I can before we turn it over to your questions. But in all seriousness, we want you to engage in this. So when it's time for your questions, raise your hand, I'll call on you, the mic will magically make its way to you. Please keep your questions brief. Please, a quick grammatical reminder, questions end in question marks. We're not looking for comments or speeches. We want to get as many in as we can. So I'll ask a couple of broad questions to start, then pick on each of them based on their topics, and then we will get to yours. So we've seen, as we said, there have been lots of ups and downs in the relationship recently, but also long term. But let's think a little more closer. And what, and I'll just go down the line, Jake, Victor, then Jim. In your view, what are the most consequential inflection points in the U.S. China relationship over the past year, and how have they reshaped the strategic landscape for both countries? Jake, I'll throw that softball to you.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the organizers. Very glad to be here. This is an extremely important conversation that we're having. The Quincy Institute is a think tank that works to make American foreign policy less militaristic and less interventionist, more focused on diplomacy and mutually beneficial interactions. Obviously, China is at the heart of that agenda. So I spend most of my time talking to policymakers in DC, and the climate in DC on China is very hostile. I think it can be hard to appreciate how hostile it is and how strong the consensus that we are headed towards conflict, and that's entirely the fault of China. So we just have to prepare for it. There's nothing we can do on our side to reduce the likelihood of conflict. That sort of accepted wisdom is very strong in Washington. Now, what Sean said about Trump, I think, is quite right, though. And there is a real opening under Trump to break open that consensus, to explore other possibilities for the future of the U.S. China relationship. And so just in response to that question, I think the single most important inflection point was the sort of weird post-Liberation Day, tariffs up to 145%, a lot of bluster on both sides, a lot of refusal on both sides to call each other, even though both sides were quite certain the other side really wanted to call them, and then the meeting, and then the tariffs back down. So the tariffs are still quite high, much higher than they were before the beginning of the second Trump administration, but they are not at 145%, at least not until November 1st. And we'll see what happens on November 1st, although I am cautiously optimistic that we will not have a rerun of that. But I think that the willingness on both sides to run it up, to escalate to the point where both sides were going to just smash the hell out of each other and do really serious damage to themselves and to the global economy, and then the willingness on both sides to bring it back down because they recognized how damaging that would be on both sides. That, to me, I think both sides then understood how they could deal with each other. And I think that coming out of that, both sides see, and I think that this will be very unnerving for everybody involved in these issues, but this is the way that I think countries will have to deal with Trump, because he will keep pushing until he meets some serious pushback. And China is maybe the only country that is well positioned to respond to him in that way. And the fact that he is not so convinced that his credibility means that he can't back down. In fact, he thinks as long as it's something I want, then it must be something that's good. So I can do it. It doesn't humiliate me. I don't care. I made the decision, and it's the right decision, and I'm willing to go all the way back down. And there are all kinds of China hawks out there saying, like, the president embarrassed himself. The president showed, the Trump always chickens out. These whole things. He doesn't care about that stuff. So I think that moment really showed us who Trump is, what he's willing to do, how he's willing to escalate, but also how he's willing to bring it back down. That showed, I think, very conclusively to China that the way to deal with Trump was not to try to give concessions bit by bit and keep going as he demands more. And I think ultimately that's sort of where the new kind of explosion in the relationship is coming from, is that China thinks we have to build a lot of leverage if we're going to have a successful negotiation with Trump. And on the one hand, Trump recognizes that. On the other hand, Trump is not comfortable with that. And again, as Sean said, he's not always in touch with the rest of what is going on in his administration. And so that's going to make for a lot of a really bumpy ride in this. And I'm afraid that we're going to see cycles of this repeat over and over and over. But I think that we should also recognize that this shows us that there is an opening for people who have a different vision of the future of U.S. China relations to try to push people in Congress, try to push people in the administration to offer policy ideas that would be more constructive than what the administration is going to come up with on its own. Those are all openings for those of us who want these changes that really weren't there 2 years ago when that consensus on future conflict seemed ironclad.
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously I agree, this kind of taco policy making, but I think I would even go back a little bit, and I'll just go ahead and say that I think the biggest event that reshaped U.S.-China relationship was the election of Donald Trump as opposed to, Kamala Harris. And the reason for that is because, and then you alluded to this, is that Trump's domestic priorities of, destroying the NSF, the NIH, academia, much of academia, alienating all of our allies, almost gives him deprive him of the policy choices that he would have had in a competition with China. And so that leaves him with nothing but this kind of very unpredictable blustering, And we've seen a couple rounds of that, first time in sort of late spring, early summer, and now we're seeing another round where he has to, wake up one day, announce 100% tariff, and then quickly realizing that he actually cannot go through with it, and then going back down with it. And in the whole process, of course, we lose more credibility in the eyes of the Chinese government. On China's side, actually, I don't see any big change, actually, because I think years ago, they had expected something like this that could happen, and they had figured out all kinds of contingency plans in the event that the U.S. go all out and start a trade war with China. They even have scenarios for even more dire policies from the U.S. government. So I think they are just implementing some of these plans in accordance to all the data and planning that they had done years before. So I think the big change here definitely is the election of Donald Trump, I would say.
I would say we have consequential things happening day by day. I think the most consequential is that China has learned from the United States how to put on pressure. After the tariffs, the Liberation Day, Scott Bessent said, well, China's only holding a pair of twos in this game. Well, then they found out China's got a straight flush, because China has really corralled its rare earth businesses, its magnets. They've learned from us on how to structure tit for tat. I mean, if you look at what they've learned from us. They've watched the sanctions and restrictions we put on them, and they've mirrored it on their side. And they do have enormous power right now because we can slow them down on chips. We can slow them down, but they're able to iterate and figure out workarounds, and there's going to be more and more funding going into chips. Rare earths and magnets, they can stop us in our tracks. They control rare earths and magnets that everybody uses from missiles to your refrigerator, and they can stop us in their tracks. So who's got the real leverage in these negotiations? Why are the negotiations kind of bumping along? Because China's in no hurry, because they're in a much better position than the U.S.
All right, I'll stick with you, Jim, and I'll work this way back down the table. So you spent decades working in and with China, and Sean referenced the Grateful Dead, what a long, strange trip it's been, and you raised your hand as a Grateful Dead fan. So given the long, strange trip it's been for you, how have you seen the business and political climate evolve or devolve for foreign companies operating there? We talk about navigating a dynamic relationship. How are foreign MNCs? We've talked about the MNCs a bit, but also, let's talk about the SMEs, because if we're talking about Washington State as well, we're also talking about SMEs there. How are they handling doing business in China now, given all the trade stress, the sanctions, and just the political drama?
Well, actually, the Chinese government is being nicer to them than ever because they don't want them to leave. They want foreign business there. They want foreign investment. The multinationals, the law firms have pulled out, the investment banks have pulled out or really pulled back because the big deals aren't happening anymore, and that's where they make their money. But that doesn't mean there's boutique deal shops that are doing very well because there's a lot of small M&A going on right now with companies are kind of right-sizing. Chinese companies with these dynamic founders who are getting old, their kids would rather drink wine in Paris than make wire harnesses in Wuhan, so they're selling. So there's a lot going on in the deal space. Multinationals tell me the major reasons they want to be in China. One is the size of the China market. Even if you have a 3% growth, you got $9 trillion in new economic activity over the next decade. And if you're in a business and you want to scale that product or scale what you do, China's where you can scale it. The second one is innovation. The innovation in China is so fast and furious and competitive that they don't have to invent something. They'll take it and they'll scale it and they'll iterate and they'll change the way it goes and they'll make it a global product. And one thing I've been hearing is China was very good at making good enough technology at a low price. Now they're making top technology at a low price, and this is going to be coming at us all around the world in every kind of product you can think of, because the Chinese companies, they'll accept 6% EBITDA because they've got scale. The foreign companies want 15 to 20, and so that competition is coming our way. The third reason is the Chinese companies are really good, and they think they know their next global competitor is coming out of China, so they better know who these people are to compete with them, maybe to partner with them, and so you can't not be in China is what I hear over and over from companies.
So we do have a panel right after this focusing on tariffs. So I don't want to focus a lot of attention on tariffs here, except President Trump on Friday said that he was going to impose a 100% tariff on all products from China in response to curbs that Beijing announced on rare earth metals. And Jake, you had that initial tariff wars, your first inflection point. Victor, you very conveniently released a paper last month on tariffs, including a look at what would happen if we got back to this kind of 145% tariff. So what kind of economic impact would that have in the US if we don't see a taco, right? If Trump does not back down?
Yeah, I think, for those of you who are interested, if you Google wages and tariffs and UCSD, you'll find the original text. We collaborated with the econ department at UCSD, which uses very fancy model, taking into account, hundreds of variables to try to estimate this. So, like with these estimations, not always 100%, but, this is a very sophisticated model. But basically what we found is that the farm states and farming area will be the biggest victims of higher tariffs that the U.S. is imposing in China, as well as Chinese retaliatory tariffs, because they're sort of getting hit on both sides. As you know, a lot of farm machineries, some of the fertilizer are imported from China. And then a major market for farm goods, of course, is China. And with the retaliation and the tariffs, basically farmers in general across the United States will suffer a 3% decline in income this year. If we do see 145%, if we don't see, we have current tariff levels of 45%, then it's something like 1% reduction in income. Washington State will see a 0.7% reduction in real income. So real income is like your purchasing power is lower because of higher prices as well as less ability to sell to China. That's the combined effect of real income decline. What's really astonishing is that if we were to go back to a world of low tariffs pre-2016, farmers as a group across the United States will enjoy an income increase of 10%. Real income. I mean, that is tremendous. And then in Washington State, it would be a 3% increase in real income. So these are big effects. I mean, so if you take the difference between 145% and the pre-2016 world, almost every state and almost every sector has suffered substantial real income decline as a result of it. So hopefully the 145% tariff doesn't stick. But if we were to stick the farming community, and we know we've heard all the anecdotes, you know, farmers suffering and so on and so forth, and the economic models bear that out. I think not just our model, but other models. And these are Trump's voters. So this is the thing that I don't understand. I mean, at a certain point, there has to be some political pressure on the current administration to change policies.
Jake, when responding to the first question, you said that now there's an opening for those with a different view. So in the current climate, what would that kind of viable alternative strategy look like that balances competition with stability? You know, what would this, you talked about a constructive approach. What would a constructive alternative look like in practice, given like the bipartisan hawkishness that we see in Congress?
Yeah, this is a complicated question because I think at one level, the conflict between the U.S. and China is about immediate friction points and restrictions that we're placing on each other and places that we're trying to counter each other outside in relations with the rest of the world. And I think under the Trump administration, we could potentially, and the military dimension is certainly a very important part of this, the question of Taiwan in particular, but also the South China Sea, the East China Sea. There are all these, the Indian border with China. There are all these potential military flashpoints as well. And the economic frictions tend to bleed into the military frictions and are increasingly conceptualized as part of the same thing, that we have to restrict China across every domain because ultimately they are a fundamental national security threat. And I think so. I think there's potential within in the Trump era to reduce a lot of these immediate friction points, because Trump himself just doesn't prioritize a lot of the systematic competition that the Biden administration did. For example, like who's going to wield the most geopolitical power, who's going to have the most influence in international institutions, who's going to dominate the tech stack. Like all of these things are issues that I don't think it actually has to be one or the other, but the foreign policy establishment in DC has concluded that it is one or the other, and we have to act in line with that. And of course, that's unacceptable to China. Trump doesn't share those assumptions. So I think there is progress on some of those immediate flashpoint frictions. The problem, though, I think, is that ultimately there is a set of structural movement within the global system that is driving those more immediate surface level points of friction. And that is not something that I think the Trump administration is going to be very successful in making progress on. Fundamentally, I think this is about the rise of China to geopolitical power and the unacceptability of that reality for most of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, which has become very committed to the idea of American primacy over the global system. Number one. And number two, I think there are deep dysfunctions in the global economy that have made growth increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people, which means that growth is slower because there are fewer consumers out there to absorb the production that's being made. China's particular growth model, which relies on systematically increasing production and trying to seize control in high-tech markets, as well as increasingly trying to keep low-tech output by mechanizing factories. This poses a very serious threat to developing countries that are hoping to move up the value chain by starting to export things at the lower level. And this also poses a serious threat to the slower growing economies in the United States and Europe, Japan, South Korea, that are worried about losing their high value production. So these are structural issues in the global economy with slow rates of growth, not enough consumers being created, not enough jobs being created, and a very uneven distribution of income in the global system as a whole, between rich and poor within countries and between rich and poor countries globally. So it's those sets of issues that ultimately are turning the global system into a zero-sum landscape where the US and China see only room for one or the other to come out on top. Can the Trump administration address these issues? I don't think so. The sort of strange situation I found myself in sort of trying to develop policy suggestions that would go in a different direction is that I think the Biden administration was sensitive to a lot of these structural issues, but they were unwilling to pursue reforms that would have made it possible for the U.S. and China to coexist. They were rather devoted to the idea of U.S. dominating these systematic features of the global system. And we're not willing to work with China. We're not willing to reform in ways that would have opened up space for China and other countries, like rising countries in the global South. Trump doesn't care about those things, but he also doesn't have any interest in figuring out the climate crisis. He doesn't have any interest in, or quite the opposite, he wants to destroy, for example, the global minimum corporate tax that the OECD advanced under Biden. He doesn't have any interest in something like a global wealth tax. He doesn't have any interest in the multilateral initiatives that would be required to open up a different approach to authority and prosperity in the global system. So I think when I think about how this could all come together in a way that doesn't lead to serious geopolitical conflict, it comes down to sort of breaking that consensus that we will have conflict with China in the short term, that Trump offers that ability, and then opening up space to talk about what a different policy agenda would look like if we did want to reform the global system in ways that made space for both the United States and for China. I suspect that probably will have to go through the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party isn't in the right place on that issue either. The Democratic Party, for the most part, thinks that China is the villain here. China needs to be restricted. And I think they're under the illusion that all of that will not lead to very serious conflict. So there's a lot of, I think, self-deception and not being honest about the direction that policy is going, that was going under Biden and could go again. If the sort of Jake Sullivan leadership in the Democratic Party returns to power, or if some of the other elements in the Trump administration that Sean discussed gain influence and push a more confrontational China policy. There is a moment here, I think, to break open that consensus, but then developing an alternative approach to moving the world towards a more multipolar but cooperative, multilateral kind of multipolarity, rather than a bunch of great powers kind of fighting each other over who's going to dominate the whole system. That's kind of the direction I think that we need to go, but it is, I think, a complex path that will run through working with both parties in turn.
So if we can stay on this.
Could you stay close to your mic?
Thanks, Bob. If we could stay on this issue of conflict and the consensus that conflict is inevitable in the relationship. And one of the possible drivers of conflict would be Taiwan, right? A Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So how do you assess the risk of escalation, especially over Taiwan, in this current trajectory of the U.S. China relationship?
Yeah, this of course, this is by far the most dangerous short-term possibility is that, and I see, so Trump himself doesn't care about Taiwan, I think, except for maybe using it as leverage in negotiations over what he does want from China. But that itself is kind of a destabilizing issue because it is a priority for China to see progress on what they see as Taiwan returning to Chinese sovereignty. And it's unlikely that we're going to get that because of developments in Taiwan and also because of more aggressive and antagonistic developments on the Chinese side. So there's going to be continuing frustration in Beijing that they're not making progress towards their vision of the resolution of Taiwan. I certainly do not think that China has any intention or desire to invade Taiwan by 2027 or whatever number various people in the Pentagon have been throwing around these last years. The Chinese government recognizes quite clearly that that would basically blow up the global system and be devastating for China's economy, which relies significantly on a prosperous and stable global system. So I don't think China would ever make a move on that unless it felt backed into a corner. Unfortunately, there are people in the Pentagon, in particular Bridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary for Policy, who advocate a much more aggressive military posture of the United States towards China in the region. And you could see how dynamics in the administration of people trying to manipulate Trump to get him on their agenda might lead him to make decisions that could be very destabilizing, that would lead to some kind of spiral. I don't think that's likely, but I do see that as a real possibility. And that kind of volatility around this issue was really not not a possibility under Biden, under a more stable leadership that had a clearer understanding of the dangers. So even though the Biden administration did, I think, push things in a very antagonistic way, the possibility of crisis was lower. There is a possibility of a crisis, but I think there also is a possibility of the U.S. and China reducing the tension around this issue that, again, sort of aligns with my overall feeling of the Trump administration. There's a possibility to really change the basic coordinates of conflict in the relationship. And then there's also a possibility of things spinning out of control into unmanageable conflict.
Well, that's cheery. Victor, I want to come back to tariffs, and you talked about how like a snapback to the 145% tariffs would affect the U.S. But how are Trump's tariffs affecting China's economy? And longer term, do you think that China can successfully pivot away from the United States to new markets and sustain their domestic demand?
Yeah, well, I think it's the bigger impact on China's economy has been the anticipation of aggressive trade policies from the U.S., which, again, years ago, basically persuaded the Chinese government to reorient policies even more so toward the supply side. So they've thrown, trillions and trillions of dollars into building up stacks across a number of products. Back in 2012, China still imported a lot of precision machineries, obviously all the chips and other sort of higher precision, higher technology products. They've been able to reduce that dependency by a large extent across most sectors, except for chips. Obviously China, because of this export control by the United States, is still not there. But that has not been a free lunch in that China has gone into a lot higher debt level in the past, 13 years or so, especially in the wake of COVID. There was a big fiscal shock in China, and the central government had to get into humongous amount of deficit spending, as we did. Except in China, instead of giving the money to ordinary people, which is what we did here, they gave the money to companies so that they don't go under, so that they can keep innovating, so that they can keep expanding market share. But the result of that is that, yes, China now dominates in a number of sectors, but then domestic demand is still very weak. The fiscal situation is a mess. So China actually needs the firms that they have invested in to succeed. And basically, the only way to succeed is to directly or indirectly export to the United States. So there's all this talk in China. It's like, oh, we don't need the U.S. market. We can, export to developing countries, good luck with that. The only country that has dramatically increased import from China during the trade war is Russia. And the only reason why Russia is doing it is because they're in a war, but they're being sanctioned by most other countries in the world. At the end of the day, to really keep up with export growth, China has to directly and indirectly export to the United States, which is why I think at the end of the day, I agree with you that China, it would be very bad decision-making for China to blow up completely the relationship with the United States. And I don't think they want to do it unless they're backed into a corner on the issue of Taiwan. But everything else, I think it is negotiable. It's just that China is in a much better position to negotiate today compared to 10 years ago, let's say.
Thanks. Now, Jim, coming back to you, so there's a session later in the day that's going to look at tech innovation and AI. So I won't ask the AI competition question that I really want to, but I do want to ask you about a couple other sectors that China is looking to dominate and what that means. I mean, Sean said one of the 5 priorities for the government was to have Chinese companies be global, and we're seeing a couple sectors where there's significant progress there. First is EVs. Can you kind of walk us through the shape of the EV industry in China and how it developed?
Yeah, they've been working on it for a couple of decades now, and as it got developed, and Tesla coming in was a big deal. They gave Tesla such so much help building a factory in a year, free land. He brought in the supply chain, and that developed for everybody. I think in 2018 there was 500 EV companies registered. I don't know how many of them went forth. There's about Last estimate I heard is 130 now. Every May, this is what happens in China. The Communist Party's slogan could be anything worth doing is worth overdoing. And so everybody wanted an EV factory. And so these mayors all have these EV factories, most of which are losing money, but now they have to keep pumping money into them for the jobs to keep going. There'll be a completely big shakeout on that. But then we say, well, they're all subsidized, so these cars are not going to last. Well, you got to look at these private companies. You got BYD, you got Xiaomi, you got Chery. These companies are amazing. I work with Xiaomi. Xiaomi was a handset company, right? They wanted to make an EV. They spent a lot of years studying it, working on supply chains. Well, they built an EV factory of 750,000 square meters in 2 years. All robotic. When their car came out into a crowded market, it's sold out in 2 years. They put out a car every 76 seconds. What they do on phones? They have a dark factory that has no people in it. It's all automatic inputs. It puts out a phone every 1 second. I say that as an example. That's just one company. The manufacturing, China's the leading manufacturer in the world. So EVs are going to have a shakeout. They're starting to move overseas. A number of them are putting in R&D plants, R&D facilities in Munich. I think BYD is now. I think Chery's in Spain and BYD's in Hungary. I may have that wrong, but they're starting to spread around the world. So this is real. I mean, when we were in Washington with the AmCham in the spring or May, I was pushing Congress. Why don't we do joint ventures? Let's do what China did. Let's allow these companies to come in under joint ventures and force technology transfer. If they're better at us than batteries and green energy and EVs and all these things, let's just flip the script. And our companies need this stuff. Let's learn from China. We kind of got to get over ourselves. China is the manufacturing future of the world. I think there's 411 or so United Nations different product categories or manufactured product categories. They're in every one of them. There's the factories in China you can eat off the floor. They're very advanced. They got more robotics going than the rest of the world. So is that enough?
Never enough.
Let's look at another sector that you mentioned to me that China looks poised to dominate, and that's drug development. So how is China building up a competitive pharma sector, and is it following the same playbook it did for AI and EVs?
Well, this reminds me of the dot-com boom in 2000, when young Chinese came back from the Silicon Valley, having gone to school here and worked for Yahoo and the other burgeoning companies. And they came and they started, Sina, Sohu, on and on. That's happening in drugs now. Yeah, we have all these people that have worked for Pfizer and wherever and universities. They're flooding back to China for opportunity. They're also flooding back because they're scared to be in America. With the Jeff Sessions China Initiative and all this other nonsense. And they're flooding back, and they are, your clinical trials will happen faster. The drug developments happen faster. So it's flipped the script a bit. The 30% over 30% of global drug licensing this year is coming out of China. The multinationals are now buying the ex-China rights to Chinese drugs under development because it can happen so much faster. And they've got some very good things going on in cancer. And this is, this larger issue of scaring the talent of China out of America. I'm waiting for some journalists to really dig into this, because the quality of the people that are leaving that have been here 20, 30 years or at universities. One thing that caught my eye was in Georgia Tech, I think it was, this professor who's renowned around the world for inventing nano energy, which I have no idea what that is, but it sounds really cool. And he went back to China and he's got a 700-person lab. That is happening over and over now, and you got billionaires starting new universities. So this drug, what's going on in drugs is just one thing. Now there's people in Washington that worried that drugs, this is going to be the new EVs because China will be so good at developing drugs, we'll drop off and won't be so good at developing it. And actually a draft executive order was leaked from the NSC where it was going to block these drugs, this happening. And a New York Times did a story and it blew up immediately because Jared Kushner and Peter Thiel and others, they've got investments in various drugs and they don't want this stuff to be blocked. So we'll see where it goes.
Can I have a two-finger on this issue? Yeah, so this is, I think pharmaceutical is a perfect case where China also needs the United States. I mean, the U.S. Companies can cut costs dramatically, as you said, but the domestic market for pharmaceuticals is just abysmal because the government is not going to underwrite paying for these drugs for Chinese people. They're fiscally very constrained. There's a list of drugs on the government procurement list, but the government is paying like 1/10 of 1 cent per dose, right? So pharmaceuticals, they develop this wonderful drugs. They can't really sell it at scale in China. So they need an outside market. You have price limitation in Western Europe and maybe even in Japan. I don't know about Japan very much, but the US is really the one big remaining market where Chinese developed drugs can be sold. So Chinese pharmaceuticals also need the US. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, very much so. Volume-based procurement.
Yeah.
Companies that used to sell something for $100 are now allowed to sell it for $2. They're doing this in medical devices. They're doing it across the board, and it's really hitting all the foreign companies in China very strongly.
So, Victor, we've looked at kind of the domestic situation in the U.S., the constraints there. But let's talk about the domestic potential constraints that Xi is facing, right? Maybe not such a tenuous grip on power, but there are political and economic constraints that shape Xi's response to the Trump administration's pressure tactics specifically and to broader foreign policy decisions. So can you give us an overview of what actually is constraining Xi?
Yeah, I think the biggest constraint is the one that I sort of alluded to already, is the fiscal constraint. They, spent, so we worry about our deficit, but China now runs a de facto deficit of 8 to 10% of GDP every year because local governments are completely bankrupt, because the land market has been destroyed by the property downturn that we've seen in the past few years. So basically, the domestic demand is very weak and keeps getting weaker, and Xi Jinping has ordered the technocrats to deal with it. They can't come up with anything to successfully deal with it. I mean, like this year is a little bit better because of this, you can turn in your old refrigerator to get a new one at a discount program, like the junk for, I don't know how you would call that, like the
Cash for clunker.
Yeah, cash for clunker program. Exactly. Yeah, there you go. Thanks. So that has lifted demand a little bit. It's really helped the EV sector. But I just don't think that's sustainable, right? Because cash for clunkers, once the people who can afford it got the new fridges, new EVs, et cetera, it's going to run out of steam. So then you have all this overcapacity. You still need to export, right? And again, the U.S. is still the largest potential export market, especially at a time when Russia is running out of steam fiscally, and Western Europe is not doing very well economically. You can saturate markets like Mexico and Brazil, but then they very quickly reach a sort of saturation point. So you still need to negotiate with the U.S. to potentially open up the U.S. market for some of the goods. And of course, on the U.S. side, we would love to have cheap Chinese EVs and consumer electronics, et cetera, et cetera.
So before we get into Q&A, I've got a couple minutes left here. And so I want to do a lightning round challenge, which will challenge you all on brevity and conciseness. But let's see what we can do. Just a couple quick questions that might help kind of inform some other questions from the audience. So Jake, starting with you, What's one U.S. policy shift that you believe could most constructively reshape the relationship with China?
Yeah, I think given the current political conjunction, the place to look is this joint venture framework that that Jim mentioned. There's a lot of stuff that Trump wants, like soybean sales and airplane sales, and like these are good for both countries. Those are a good direction to go, but it doesn't change the tenor of the relationship. So a joint venture framework, if it were successful, and that's hard to pull off in this administration, I think. But if it were successful, it would bring in more investment into the United States from China. It would normalize it, make people understand that China is not this sort of unique menace that is trying to subvert our society or something. So it would feel more normal for China to have an economic presence in the United States, but it would be done on terms that would help diffuse technology. I for one, think that the forced technology transfer was really, the China practice was really positive for the global economy. It forced the diffusion of wealth that very restrictive intellectual property law would have made otherwise impossible. It led to development in China, in contrast to other developing countries that were not able to develop in that way. But turnaround is fair play, and I think that would help the United States to have forced technology transfer of our own. And I think if you could even write the rules to require union neutrality agreements, and you could bring on democratic support for this reform if you got unions backing it. And I've talked with unions who are open to this idea. So I think that it would not just be good economic policy, it would also change the political dynamics by moving both political parties, or at least sort of opening a fracture in both political parties around this issue, and getting politicians in Washington on board for a different approach to China around consequential policy.
Great, thanks. Victor, the one U.S. policy shift.
To me, without a doubt, it's lowering tariff rates on most goods. Because, of course, China pursued industrial policies for years, and, you can say, oh, that's unfair. But China got something out of it. They now can, at least have sizable presence in a lot of different technology stacks. Tariff policy in the part of the U.S., it's like paying a lot for a meal that tastes bad. We literally will get nothing out of it in most cases. And you have ordinary people, especially farmers, especially people who live in actually Wyoming and North Dakota, are getting hit very hard. Suffering significant income declines. Even here in Washington State, it's hundreds of dollars this year in income decline under current tariff rates. Why are we doing it? So it serves no purpose. And that will also signal to China of goodwill and potentially get some kind of concessions from the Chinese government.
Well, I'll tell you something that can never happen, but it would be nice. We should have real structured exchanges with members of Congress going to China on a regular basis, and also having members of the National People's Congress coming here. If the two legislatures can have talking back and forth, because right now in Washington, the loudest voices in Congress on China have been to Panda Express twice. They don't know anything about China, and and they are influential. We need to have smart people, because China's smart. We got to get smart on China and start dealing with it. Where we really sit, what powers we have, what we don't have, and what outcome do we want? Right now, there's no outcome other than, are we going to go to war? Is that the outcome we're aiming at?
So let's stay on getting smart on China, Jim. And what's the most misunderstood aspect of China's strategic thinking in the United States? What do we not get?
I'm stealing this line from Anne Stevenson Young in her book. America got confused that reform in China meant they wanted to change their system. They just wanted to reform. They just wanted to reform their system in their own way. They didn't want to change their system to be more like us.
I think one thing that especially the current administration seems not to understand is how prepared the Chinese government is for almost every contingency. I mean, so, because we deal with a lot of think tanks in China, and then after a while, you're like, wait a minute, there are like hundreds of high-level think tanks in China, and they all have very smart people, and there's a internal incentive for them to write these reports and send them to the central government on all kinds of contingencies and across all kinds of policies. So you can't, use this kind of poker game tactic. It was like, oh, I'm going to do this surprising thing. This will not be surprising to the Chinese government because they already thought of it. So I think that's not very well understood in DC today, it seems.
Yeah, a lot of the animosity in Washington around China, I don't think this is what is motivating it, but if you push on it, it will come back to, well, we tried to have a good relationship with China, and now we know that doesn't work. And fundamentally, the reason it doesn't work is because China is by essence incompatible with America. And I think that the sort of illustrations that people pull to hand are democracy and human rights, like we thought they were going to democratize, and instead they got more authoritarian. The issue of the forced cultural assimilation of the Uyghurs, or the crushing of one country, two systems in Hong Kong. These kinds of illustrations come immediately to hand. I don't think that, in other contexts, American policymakers don't take human rights and democracy very seriously. They have a very constructive relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example. So I don't think ultimately that's the driving force, but I think that sort of demystifying this issue is very important for those of us who want to argue for a different path. And one way that I do that is the basic claim here is China tricked us into thinking that they were going to liberalize, and now it's mask off and we see that they're exposed. We know what they were really like all along. I think this is quite wrong. I think China was liberalizing. There was very significant liberalization in the economy and in politics. From the Tiananmen Square massacre down to the end of the aughts, and then it reversed. It became more authoritarian, it became more nationalist, it became more internationally aggressive, and I think some of this was driven by insecurity, geopolitical insecurity in the region around conflicts in the South China Sea. That was sort of built on around the Obama's pivot to Asia, in the sense in the Chinese leadership, oh no, America's coming for us. They've been in the Middle East, sort of wrecking the Middle East for years and years, and now they're coming for us. And there was I think a significant overreaction on the Chinese side to the pivot to Asia. But then there's kind of an interactive back and forth where both sides are feeling insecure in the face of the other, and they become more assertive in order to deter the other side. The other side reads this as aggression, and they become more assertive in turn. So there's a security dilemma dynamic. But I think, so drawing attention to that interactivity of these dynamics is very important. And I think also important that China is not, the way that these explanations go is often like, well, China is a Leninist system, and Leninist systems by nature are going to be authoritarian and nationalist. Or sometimes this ends up being like a cultural or civilizational argument as well. Like China, like, look, 5,000 years, it's always been a dictatorship, it'll always be a dictatorship. But I think there was this inflection point, and that inflection point did not just happen in China, it happened around the world. And politics in the United States has also moved in a more authoritarian and nationalist direction. And that inflection point was around the same time, around the 2008 financial crisis. And it wasn't just China and the United States, it was Brazil, it was Poland, it was India, it was Indonesia. Like, just around the world, we have this inflection point and this move towards more authoritarian politics, more nationalist politics, more geopolitical conflict. I think having that context in mind and not just making this an issue of China is important. And then that raises the question, what do you do about it? Well, I think it's not just fated by history or by like the essence of the party or the essence of Chinese culture that the U.S. China relationship will go in one direction. I think if we can reintroduce a historical understanding of how these countries have, like our country has changed and their country has changed, if we can reintroduce sort of a historical understanding and draw attention to the concrete forces that have pushed both of our countries in the, I think, destructive direction that we've gone in the relationship and more broadly, that can help to have a more realistic set of understandings about where we could go in the future as well.
So get ready for your questions, because they've got one more lightning round question. Ask you to try to keep it to 60 seconds. And then, Sean, if you want a fair go at Jim, let me know. So let's just, reverse the question then. What is the most misunderstood aspect of U.S. strategic thinking in Beijing today? And Jake, will just start with you and we'll go down.
I haven't given thought to this. Can you come back to me?
Victor, why don't you go first?
I don't know about you. We don't have any strategic thinking these days, so there's nothing to understand there. No. But one thing I think China, except for a brief period when Wang Qishan was, had a lot of authority, there's always this underappreciation of the role of the market. There's maybe because they're a Communist Party, but I think it's, mainly because of how the state was designed back in the 1950s. There is always this very deep distrust of the market. And, of course, they've had like big stock market crashes, which deepen the distrust. But the market, I think, can also be very powerful. And I think we do see that from time to time in the U.S. And China doesn't get that. I mean, I think China, some strategic thinkers, at least some of the think tank type, I don't know so much if it's the leadership, but the think tanker type, some of them are like, oh, well, the U.S. is going to be in terminal decline, partly because they believe the market is just going to malfunction. But I just don't think that's the case. I mean, the market will malfunction from time to time, but oftentimes it is delivering the most efficient outcome. And that is going to help with the productivity of this economy. And I think that's something that a lot of thinkers, not by any means everyone, and for a while they did have people who really believed in the market, like Li Keqiang, Wang Qishan. Those people are out, as far as I can tell, the people who are in charge today, they are more suspicious of the market.
I don't really have an answer because I think China's got us pretty well figured out. They look at all the zillions of Chinese people that have studied here, and I think I agree with him. We don't have a lot of strategic thinking, and I think they've kind of got us figured out on what we're doing, and they're reacting to it and taking their own measures.
Yeah, so maybe I would turn around the comment I made about China and say that I think that you see a very strong mirror image version of that in Chinese thinking about the United States, that we were under this illusion that the United States would allow us to rise and accommodate us in the global system and give us the status we wanted. And now we know that was a trick. They were never intending on doing that. The United States always had it in for us. They were always trying to overthrow the party. They were always trying to undermine China. And I think on both sides of that argument, that just does not do justice to the actual record of engagement and growth, mutual growth on both sides through the integration between the two. And it's and that kind of a conclusion that, okay, the United States will never let us rise. And so there's not even any point in trying to have a constructive relationship with the United States. And we're just going to double down and say everything that we're doing is right. We can't make any concessions because that will just make the Americans more aggressive. And you get the exact same ideas on the American side. That necessarily leads to an escalatory spiral on both sides, as they're unable to admit, or even they think we can't make any concessions because that will weaken us in the relationship. And the way that I see it is that both sides are being pushed together because of these deeper structural problems in the way the global system has evolved since 2008. And if both sides can't recognize that both sides are dissatisfied with the global system, there's a tendency on both sides now to say, not Trump. But the Biden administration certainly was like this. They say, we stand for the status quo. China's trying to overthrow the status quo. And China said, well, no, look at your protectionism. Look, you're sabotaging the WTO. Look, you're putting these extraterritorial restrictions on us. We stand for the status quo, and you're trying to overthrow the status quo. And if both sides could just agree that they're not totally satisfied with the status quo, but they also don't want to upend the global system entirely, and instead should start talking about what a reform program would look like that they could work on together, that's really, I think, the only way to get over this sense that we have to harden ourselves against the other because it's the only way we can survive.
I'd like to make one comment. I don't know if it answers your question, but I think a lot of the U.S. establishment feels betrayed, that they put all this effort into helping China over the years. I saw so many companies and hospitals and everybody come in and really open-hearted help China. And then China going in the direction it has, they feel like we've been fooled or betrayed. I think that may be the basis of that leads to a lot of the thinking now.
Well, let's get to your questions. We should have about 10 minutes. I want to get in as many as possible. We'll start in the front here. Sorry for the microphone runners. I picked the person furthest away from you. If you could be sure just to briefly name an affiliation and to whom your question is directed, or if it's everyone.
Yeah, Wenchi Yu, Harvard Kennedy School. Just a very quick question. we've been very critical of what's happening in Washington, D.C. I'm curious if anything that you think actually they're doing right. And then in 2029, how do you see the world? That's going to be very different from now, in particular, this bilateral relationship.
Anyone want to take, is DC doing anything right? Anyone?
War ended in the Middle East?
So no takers on.
Wait, let me think.
Yeah.
What have they done right? That is very, well, okay. I think there was, and I don't even know, it seems they are, like, so there was this effort to have supply chain resilience, you know, in the Biden administration. I think that effort is continuing. I think that's still the right thing to do, right? So because China has spent years trying to reduce the number of leverages the U.S. has on China, I don't think it's wrong for us to do the same thing. It doesn't, so because having supply chain resilience, knowing that we can get supply of rare earth, and yeah, I think the Trump administration is doing a lot to support lithium and rare earth industries in the United States. That is the right thing to do, because if we know that we have that supply, then actually this gives us room to continue trading with China. Because it's like, well, we can trade with China because China can't really squeeze us on that because we have the supply. And that's going to take subsidies, which we're doing. I think that's the right thing to do.
Just on the second part of the question, what does 2029 look like? I think I have no idea what it's going to look like, but I think that we're in for a series of crises over the next 3 years that is going to totally reshape the landscape globally, the economic landscape, the geopolitical landscape, and that's going to open space for reform ideas, I think, on the other end of the extended Trump crisis, both domestically and in the international system, that right now seem totally unrealistic, because I think that the existing sort of structure of the international system it was already listing. It was very fragile. And I think this is true in the global economy and the domestic economy. If you look at how the U.S. economy is built on an AI investment bubble, you know, I don't know where these crises start. It could be a financial crisis, it could be a stock market collapse, it could be conflict around Taiwan, as I mentioned, one possibility. And some of these, I think, each of the crises will open different possibilities, but they're all sort of interrelated, and they have to do with these deep structural pressures inside the global economy. And I think that we do need to be careful not to just extend sort of where we're at right now indefinitely into the future, or take that trajectory and say, okay, this is where it's going. I think it's very unlikely that just extending the current trend lines will get us a good prediction of where we're at in 3 years' time.
I think the CHIPS Act and some of the things Biden did on bringing back manufacturing may not have been enough, but they're going in the right direction. You know, China's about 30% of global manufacturing. We're down to 10%. You know, we've got to have the robotics. We've got to, you know, make a more robust base. As far as 29, it'll be very interesting to see if Xi and Putin are still in office. That will really make a change. You know, Putin got in a constitutional amendment allows him to stay in office till 2036. Xi, in the 14th five-year plan, added this extra 15-year thing on, you know, that's when we'll be on top of technology, et cetera. I think he may plan to be around at least to 2033. Now, whether he'll be able to do that or not. And so if those two people are in office, we're going to see a different way of, you know, and the next leader of China, I think, is going to have to go in a bit of a different direction. Because she's so all powerful, but he can't leave office. He's got like 2.5 million people he's put in jail, and many of these people are from families of local, you know, productive families, or they're connected families. Is there enough bodyguards in the world to protect him after he's out of office?
Okay, Bob, got a question. Bob Cap right there. Quick question, and see how many we can get in the time remaining.
You know, many of us have grappled in the Gaza situation with the question of whether if you say anything critical of the Israeli government, you're being an anti-Semite. And the situation with China sorry, sometimes seems the same way. You say something critical of China, and the Chinese accuse you of deep-seated anti-Chinese, almost racial animus and so forth. But in fact, I think there is a dimension here that we haven't discussed. Back in the Vietnam War, General Westmoreland, among many others, noticed that the Vietnamese just didn't value human life the way we do, and put those Asians in a box which was somehow separate from our definition of humanity. And although it's not on the surface in the United States now, I think that strain, which is intrinsic to American engagement or encounters with China since the beginning of our history, is like an ember underneath the forest floor, and it can and does reignite. And I think, oddly enough, that for that reason, we went through this in the 50s. We go through it over and over again. The process of humanizing China for the American people has to start all over again, or has to be at least reinvigorated. And so even though the reference to people is usually seen as a kind of a pathetic bleat from the Kumbaya crowd, in fact, there's really something to it now. We have to start rebuilding the perception in the United States that the people of China and that China itself are part of a shared humanity and part of an earthly existence with us. And that is ultimately going to be necessary if we're going to get elected representatives in Congress, particularly from the Democratic Party, but not entirely, to begin to articulate a vision of China different from the one which prevails today. So I don't think we should eliminate the notion that there's a sort of they belong in a different category lurking here, which could lead to absolute catastrophe. Thank you.
So with that, our very efficient timekeeper told me it's time to wrap it up. I know there are questions we didn't get to, but we have networking breaks, we have lunch. You can find our speakers and continue to engage with them. Please join me in thanking them for their time and insights today.